Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Imagine, if you will, sitting at a dining table, just eating a modest bowl of rice and beans, and suddenly the glass ceiling right above you just shatters.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. A heavily intoxicated man literally falls out of the sky, crashes 13 feet through this skylight directly onto your table, mumbles something completely unintelligible, and then just stumbles out the front door into the Texas heat before you can even, drop your spoon.
It sounds, honestly, it sounds like an absurd scene from some Buster Keaton silent film. But that was just a very real standard Tuesday in 1955 at the Union Gospel Mission down in Dallas, Texas.
It really was. And that is exactly the kind of surreal, gritty reality we are exploring in this deep dive. We are looking at a book called Great is Thy Faithfulness, A History of the Union Gospel Mission, Dallas, Texas, 1949-1999, which was edited by Herman Balka. And I want to set some expectations for you right now as you're listening. We are not doing some dry corporate timeline of a nonprofit organization today.
Right. Definitely not.
We are tracing 50 years of visceral inner-city history. This is really about institutional survival on absolute shoestring budgets. It's about the evolution of urban rescue missions and, the raw, often agonizing realities of human transformation on Skid Row.
Yeah, and it provides this profoundly detailed lens into the sociology of the post-WWII American city. Because during this era, society's approach to extreme poverty, addiction, mental illness, it was radically different from today.
Oh, completely.
There's no massive standardized federal safety net, right?
Yeah.
If you fell through the cracks in Dallas in 1949, you didn't have a housing voucher, you didn't have a comprehensive social services department waiting to catch you, your safety net was localized charity.
Just whoever happened to be in your neighborhood.
Exactly. And this history forces us to examine the really delicate balance between enabling destructive behavior and offering unconditional grace. And this is all happening long before the advent of modern psychological frameworks.
Okay, let's unpack this from the very beginning, because the origins of this institution prove that massive community impact almost always starts in unmitigated chaos.
Total chaos.
We are in October 1949. Dallas is experiencing this huge post-war economic boom. Businessmen are buying new suits, families are moving out to the suburbs, but right in the shadow of that prosperity is this growing population of destitute transient men. And enter Robert J. Key.
Right, Robert J. Key. He is the mission's first superintendent. And what is crucial to understand is his background. He wasn't some trained theologian.
Right.
He didn't have a master's degree in nonprofit management. He was just a young guy working in a local department store. He spent his days surrounded by, post-war consumerism, yet he felt this overwhelming, almost inescapable compulsion to resign from his safe, secure retail job. To start a rescue mission for the men everyone else was literally stepping over on the sidewalk.
And he operated on a philosophy he called identification, which I found fascinating. He wrote these super intense letters to potential supporters. And his logic was, he argued that just as Christ identified with sinners, anyone supporting this mission had to literally identify with the destitute.
It was a huge ask.
It really was. He was telling middle-class Dallas residents, you cannot just throw spare change at this from afar. You have to tie your own spiritual and financial well-being to the absolute poorest men in this city.
It was a deeply demanding framework. I mean, he wasn't asking for pity. He was demanding co-suffering. But, implementing that kind of fiery, uncompromising idealism on a practical level immediately led to severe administrative friction. When you are operating purely on passion, reality tends to hit you very, very hard.
And it hit them in the form of a massive internal conflict. So Key brings in an assistant named Ralph Carruth. Meanwhile, Key's wife is heavily involved in the day-to-day operations. Which, sounds like a great family effort, right? Until Mrs. Key decides to bring their teenage daughters down to volunteer at the mission.
Right. And you have to picture the environment here. This isn't a sanitized community center. They are ministering to hardened, transient men. We are talking about individuals dealing with severe, untreated late-stage alcoholism, profound trauma from the Second World War, and severe psychiatric issues.
That was rough.
Very rough. And the board of directors looks at the situation and makes a completely rational, liability-driven decision. They tell Key, absolutely not. This environment is wildly unsafe for teenage girls.
So the board asks Mrs. Key to stay home. And to fill that operational gap, they officially promote Ralph Carruth to a larger role. And the interpersonal dynamics just explode. Key feels totally undermined by the board and threatened by Carruth, who in the historical documents describe as I think the quote is promotional type person.
Someone perhaps more focused on the public face of the mission.
Yeah, exactly. And the rift between the founder and his assistant grows so toxic that it paralyzes the entire operation.
What's fascinating here is this is the quintessential passion versus administration dilemma. The individuals possessing the burning zeal required to quit a steady job and wade into Skid Row are rarely the same individuals equipped with the diplomatic, calculating skills needed to manage a board of directors or to share institutional power.
It's two totally different skill sets.
Exactly. So by September 1954, the friction is destroying the work from the inside out. The board essentially forces both Key and Carruth to resign within days of each other.
Wait, hold on. You have a charity designed to save lives on the street, and it essentially decapitates its own leadership within the first few years over interpersonal drama. Is that normal? I mean, to me, it sounds more like a chaotic tech startup running out of venture capital than a charity.
The startup analogy is actually incredibly apt, but the stakes are obviously much higher, and yes, it is very common. You have founders operating in perpetual crisis mode, surrounded by life and death stakes, and they're running entirely on adrenaline and intuition. There is no HR department to mediate disputes on Skid Row. Combine that emotional volatility with the crushing existential dread of imminent bankruptcy, and it is a miracle they survived at all.
Speaking of that dread, the financial numbers detailed in this book genuinely made my chest tight.
Oh, they are staggering.
In February 1955, the Union Gospel Mission had exactly $57.71 in their bank treasury, with $350 in past due bills. Let that sink in. But it gets worse. By July of 1955, they had exactly $1.98 into the bank.
Less than $2.
Less than $2. And their debt had ballooned to $1,200. I cannot fathom looking at a line of starving men wrapped around the block, knowing your organization has a net worth of $1.98.
Right. And to put that $1,200 debt into 1955 context, that would be roughly equivalent to being $14,000 in the red today for a tiny grassroots operation. They were entirely dependent on the personal credit of their board members. There was a man named John Ferguson who was a local food broker serving as the treasurer. He routinely made personal, interest-free loans to the mission just to keep the lights on and buy bulk beans.
Wow.
And sometimes, knowing the mission could never actually repay him, he would just quietly cancel the debt. They weren't operating year to year, they were surviving meal to meal.
And right in the middle of this suffocating financial panic, the absolute absurdity of the street interrupts them, which brings us back to the story I mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive. They had moved to their second location at 411 South Hervey Street, and right next door is the Arlington Hotel, which was a notorious, grimy, $2 a night flophouse.
Yes, and the mission's dining hall was directly adjacent to this flophouse, and it featured that large glass skylight in the center of the roof.
All right, so the workers are sitting around the table. The man from the Arlington next door, heavily intoxicated, wanders out of his upstairs window, loses his footing on the roof, and plummets 13 feet through the glass. It is a terrifying moment. But here is the kicker that I didn't mention earlier. That same man, having survived falling through a ceiling, dusts himself off, walks back through the mission's front doors the very next day, attends a chapel service, and completely turns his life around.
It perfectly encapsulates the dual nature of their reality. I mean, you cannot plan for a man falling through your ceiling. It represents the absolute, uncontrollable chaos of untreated addiction and poverty. But it also represents the mission's core purpose you have to be ready to offer a lifeline when that same chaos walks back through your front door looking for actual help.
But surviving that level of sheer, unpredictable physical chaos, combined with a bank account holding less than $2, forced a harsh realization upon the leadership. A leaky roof and an empty ledger meant they could no longer afford to operate purely on intuition.
No, definitely not.
They couldn't just be an open room where people occasionally fell out of the sky. They needed a rigorous, unyielding system.
Precisely. So in March 1955, the mission brought in a new superintendent named Eldon Porter. He was a Louisiana businessman and a graduate of Bob Jones University, and he represented a massive paradigm shift. He brought a highly structured, almost clinical philosophy to the operation, and he was heavily influenced by the writings of Bishop J.C. Ryle.
Okay, let's pause here. Who is J.C. Ryle, and why is a guy in 1950s Texas modeling a homeless shelter after him?
Good question. J.C. Ryle was a prominent 19th century English Anglican bishop. He wrote extensively on the moral hazards of charity. Ryle argued that profuse charity to the poor, when given indiscriminately and without thorough inquiry, actually does profound damage.
Right, damage.
Yes, he claimed it fosters idleness, rears what he called an army of beggars, and ultimately increases the very societal evil it is attempting to relieve. Porter took Ryle's 19th century theological warning and made it the absolute operational baseline for the Dallas mission.
That is a staggering concept. The idea that giving too freely creates an army of beggars. So Porter institutionalized this belief by creating a strict meal ticket system. A transient man walks in, and Porter issues him a ticket valid for exactly 1 week. During those 7 days, Porter is watching him like a hawk.
Watching every move.
Yeah. If the man demonstrates tangible progress, actively searching for employment, showing genuine spiritual engagement, he gets an extension. But if Porter determines the man is on a downslope, just coasting and exploiting the free food, his ticket is pulled and he is out on the street.
Porter treated the mission's charity like a rigorous audit. In just his first 8 months as superintendent, he meticulously tracked 4,000 individual names. And remember, this is decades before computers or digital databases.
That's all by hand.
All by hand. This was done via index cards, cross-referencing names, and recognizing faces to weed out anyone he deemed a freeloader. But the most defining, and today perhaps the most debated aspect of Porter's system was the mandatory preaching.
Yeah, this is the literal definition of singing for your supper. To get a plate of beans, rice, and donuts, a man had to attend a chapel service at either 12:15 p.m. or 7:30 p.m. You sit through the sermon, or you do not eat. Porter bluntly stated, "We believe in ministering to a man's soul before we minister to his body."
And we must clarify that this wasn't just a generic, comforting, motivational speech. In 1951, the mission instituted a rigid doctrinal charter. While they were interdenominational, meaning Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians all volunteered together, their theology was uncompromising. To work there, you had to subscribe to tenets like the verbal inspiration of Scripture and the substitutionary death of Christ.
Right, and for those who might not be familiar with that theological terminology, substitutionary death is the belief that Christ literally took on the penalty of humanity's sin. It is the idea of an absolute cosmic ledger clearing.
Exactly. And that specific theological framework was the backbone of their entire rehabilitation model. They believed that communicating that absolute absolution was the only way to save a man's life.
So what does this all mean for us, looking back at this methodology from a modern perspective? I want you, the listener, to really put yourself in this room. You haven't eaten in 2 days. Your hands are shaking from alcohol withdrawal. Is it ethical to require a starving man to sit through a rigid theological sermon just to get a bowl of rice? Ethically, how do they justify leveraging a man's physical desperation to enforce a worldview?
This raises an important question, and it requires us to completely step out of our 21st century mindset. Today, we view addiction through the lens of neurobiology. We understand it as a disease of the brain's reward system, requiring medical intervention, therapy, and social support.
Exactly.
But in 1955, that framework did not exist in the mainstream. The prevailing societal view of a homeless alcoholic was that of a moral failure or a criminal.
Right. There were no state-funded rehab facilities doling out methadone on Skid Row.
None. So for Eldon Porter, spiritual conversion was the medical intervention. In his mind, addiction and vagrancy were merely physical symptoms of a terminal spiritual void. Think of it like this. If a doctor has a patient bleeding out from an artery, giving them a Band-Aid and a lollipop is malpractice.
Sure.
To Porter, giving a man a sandwich without giving him the gospel was spiritual malpractice. They weren't practicing long-term physical therapy. They were applying theological tourniquets to arterial bleeding. In their eyes, it wasn't coercion. It was the only actual cure available.
Wow. That reframes it entirely. Yeah. They weren't withholding food out of cruelty. They were using food as the delivery mechanism for what they genuinely believed was life-saving medicine. But as efficient as Porter's index cards and tough love systems were, an audit can only reach a person so deeply. To truly penetrate the despair of Skid Row, the mission needed someone who didn't just understand the ledger, but someone who had intimately known the gutter.
Which brings us to the defining era of the Union Gospel Mission. Porter laid the administrative tracks, but it was a man named T.J. Sullivan who drove the train for the next 3 decades. Sullivan served as superintendent from 1956 all the way to 1986.
T.J. Sullivan is a character study in profound contrast. He was not a Louisiana businessman. He grew up on a farm in Texas. By the time he was 12 years old, he was stealing and drinking his uncle's moonshine out of fruit jars.
Just 12 years old.
12. And he developed into a highly functioning karyotic alcoholic. He could plow a field, he could work, but his existence was entirely tethered to the bottle.
And his turning point is what the historical text refers to as a classic Damascus Road moment. For those unfamiliar with the term, it refers to the biblical story of the Apostle Paul, a sudden, blinding, absolute transformation. Sullivan is out in a sorghum field. It is 10:00 a.m.
Just a random morning.
Yeah. You can imagine the Texas heat, the vibration of the tractor, the sheer crushing physical and mental exhaustion of maintaining an addiction while doing hard agricultural labor. He stops the tractor, climbs down into the dirt, falls to his knees, and screams out for deliverance.
He promises that if he can just be freed from the physical craving for alcohol, he will go anywhere and do anything.
And he claimed that when he stood up from the dirt, he felt like he was floating on air. The physical dependency was instantly severed.
The detail that always strikes me is his interaction with his wife, Vanetta. She had endured the nightmare of his alcoholism for years, silently praying for him. Sullivan walks into the farmhouse for lunch that day. He sits down at the table, and without saying a single word to her, he simply bows his head to say grace over his meal.
Wow.
In that one silent gesture, Vanetta knew instantly that the nightmare was over. His entire neurological and spiritual reality had shifted. Driven by this new reality, Sullivan travels to Dallas to learn street evangelism. He starts passing out tracts on Skid Row. He notices the men he's talking to on the street keep walking to this one building, the Union Gospel Mission. He follows them inside, starts volunteering 1 day a week, and eventually takes over the entire operation from Porter. And Sullivan implements one non-negotiable rule. Absolutely no one leaves the mission without being asked about their spiritual condition.
Nobody. It didn't matter if you came in to ask for directions, to fix a pipe, or to use the restroom. Sullivan was going to sit you down, look you in the eye, and present the plan of salvation. His relentless consistency led to an estimated 100 conversions a month. But the secret to his success wasn't just persistence. It was his unparalleled street credibility. Sullivan was entirely unconscionable.
Right. The book mentions a street term the men used, taking a nosedive. That meant an addict would fake a religious conversion. Going down to the altar, crying, repenting, just to guarantee they'd get a warm bed and extra meals for the week.
Yes. And Sullivan, having lived a life of deceit as a functioning alcoholic, knew every manipulation in the book. He could spot a nosedive from across the room. He knew exactly who was faking it. But, and this is where his genius lay, he let them fake it. He welcomed them anyway.
Which is so interesting to me.
Right. He operated on the hope that if he kept them in the environment long enough, exposing them to genuine grace and structure, the fake tears would eventually turn into real transformation.
Wait, let me push back on this because it directly challenges modern protocols.
Yeah.
Today, to run a crisis center, you need a master's degree in social work, clinical supervision, state licensing, trauma-informed care training, all of it. Sullivan was a farm boy who drank moonshine. He had zero formal psychological education. How does a guy with purely lived experience effectively manage complex psychiatric and addiction crises compared to a clinically trained professional?
It fundamentally alters the power dynamic in the counseling room. In psychological literature, there is a concept known as the wounded healer. When Sullivan sat across a desk from a man trembling with DTs, delirium tremens, he possessed an authority that no university degree could bestow. He wasn't diagnosing a subject from an academic pedestal. He was looking at a peer from the trenches.
Because he had run the exact same cons.
Exactly. He offered this incredibly rare, potent combination, radical empathy mixed with zero gullibility. A clinician might have the vocabulary to label trauma, but Sullivan had the visceral somatic language to connect with it. He couldn't be manipulated, but crucially, he also couldn't be disgusted by them. For the men on Skid Row, his own ruined past was his most powerful credential.
Here's where it gets really interesting. To truly grasp the impact of Sullivan's empathy and Porter's structured systems, we have to look closely at the men they were dealing with. We need to open what I call the anthology of the streets. The source text provides these astonishing detailed testimonies of the people walking through those doors.
These case studies are vital because they shatter the monolithic stereotype of the mid-century hobo. The men winding up on the streets of Dallas carried wildly diverse, often terrifying backstories.
Think about a time you made a massive mistake. Maybe you ruined a relationship or made a terrible call at work, and you felt that sickening knot of anxiety in your stomach. Now multiply that physiological dread by 1,000 and sustain it for 30 years. That is what the 1928 murderer was carrying when he walked into the mission.
This was an elderly man who arrived at the mission carrying an unspeakable secret. Back in August 1928, in the hills of Alabama, he caught a man attempting to steal moonshine from his still. In the dark, a fight broke out. The man pulled a pocket knife and, by his own confession to the mission staff, literally cut the thief to shreds while the man begged for mercy.
He told the staff that about a year and a half after the murder, the psychological dam broke. He started having visions of the victim's blood floating before his eyes every time he tried to sleep. He spent decades running across the country, self-medicating, trying to outrun a ghost. We would recognize this today as profound PTSD and somatic hallucination caused by extreme guilt.
He arrives at the mission, an exhausted, broken man. They don't have a psychiatric ward. They offer him a specific passage of Scripture Revelation 3.20, which speaks of Christ standing at the door and knocking. And this man, who had been hunted by the memory of blood for 30 years, claimed to experience an instantaneous, total psychological and spiritual reset. The haunting ceased.
Then you have Joe the Embezzler, whose story is like a 1950s noir thriller. Joe was a bartender in California. His boss trusted him implicitly to the point of letting Joe take the day's cash receipts home to deposit them the next morning. One night, Joe gets incredibly drunk, looks at the $600 in cash, which was a massive sum at the time, easily a few months' wages, and he bolts. He jumps on a train and flees to Dallas.
He burns through the money, hits rock bottom, and winds up at the Union Gospel Mission. Under Sullivan's guidance, Joe experiences a spiritual conversion. But Sullivan's theology required behavioral proof. He essentially tells Joe, if this conversion is real, you can't just hide out in Dallas. You have to go back to California and face the consequences of your theft.
Imagine the terror of that train ride back west. Joe buys a ticket, fully expecting to walk into a California police precinct, be placed in handcuffs, and go to federal prison. He walks in, confesses, and the police look at him blankly. His boss had never filed charges. Joe tracks down his former boss to confess, and the owner just looks at him and says, "Pay me back when you get a job, and we'll forget the whole thing."
Wow. It is a stunning moment of secular grace that perfectly mirrored the spiritual grace he'd found at the mission. And then, countering the narrative of the uneducated vagrant, you have Homer Adair. Homer was a highly articulate, successful department store manager. He was the kind of guy who traveled to New York to promote the World's Fair. He had a beautiful family and a thriving career. But his social drinking slowly, insidiously evolved into a catastrophic physical dependency.
This self-awareness was tragic, really. He realized he was dragging his wife down into his own personal hell. So he actually initiated his own divorce to protect her from himself. He became what he called a wandering drunkard. In 1958, he wanders into the mission just wanting a shave, a cup of coffee, and to get back out onto the street. He hears the chapel music, feels a wave of conviction, and physically tries to sneak out the back door.
But Sullivan spots him. Sullivan intercepts Homer, physically guides him into the counseling office, and spends an hour walking him through the scriptures. Homer later testified that within an hour of leaving that office, he was offered Thunderbird wine, a notoriously cheap, highly fortified street alcohol by 3 different men on the street. And for the first time in years, the compulsion to drink was entirely gone. He stayed at the mission, achieved long-term sobriety, and, incredibly, served as the assistant superintendent for 10 years.
But the psychological profile that is perhaps the most intense is the Marine. This was a veteran of the Pacific Theater in World War II. He arrived at the mission deeply disturbed, suffering from what we now recognize as severe combat trauma and moral injury. He came in complaining of a physical back problem, asking for prayer.
As the staff went to pray for him, they noticed he was wearing a Buddha idol around his neck. When they asked about it, the backstory was chilling. The Marine explained that he had taken the idol off the body of a Japanese officer he had killed in hand-to-hand combat. It wasn't just a trinket, it was a physical manifestation of his trauma, a literal talisman of the atrocities he had survived and committed.
The mission worker told him, "I cannot pray for your healing in the name of Jesus while you are clinging to that idol." The Marine became furious. He refused to give it up and stormed out of the building.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to understand what that idol represented. It was his justification, his guilt, and his identity forged in the nightmare of war. Asking him to hand it over was asking him to surrender his grip on his own trauma. It was terrifying for him. Yet the conviction was so strong that he returned days later, voluntarily surrendered the idol to the staff, confessed the nightmares of his wartime actions, and found peace.
What's fascinating to me is the recurring psychological through line in every single one of these stories. Yes, they were all struggling with alcohol or vagrancy, But the alcohol was never the disease, it was the anesthetic.
Exactly. The underlying disease was profound, soul-crushing shame. Whether it was the literal blood on the hands of the 1928 murderer, the betrayal of Joe the Embezzler, the self-sabotage of Homer Adair, or the moral injury of the Marine, these men were drinking to suppress their own memories.
And the secular psychological programs of the 1950s, where they existed at all, often lacked the vocabulary to address that level of existential shame. They might offer behavioral modification, but they couldn't offer cosmic absolution.
The mission offered a mechanism for an immediate, absolute psychological reset. They didn't tell these men, you need to learn to forgive yourself, which is a nearly impossible task for a murderer. They told them, the creator of the universe has already forgiven you, the ledger is clear. That external divine validation was the only force powerful enough to break the cycle of shame and addiction.
As the stories of these miraculous turnarounds spread, the sheer volume of desperation arriving at the mission's doorstep grew exponentially. But it wasn't just transient men riding the freight trains anymore. The socioeconomic landscape of Dallas was changing, and the face of urban poverty was changing with it. The mission had to physically and operationally adapt. This shifts our focus to the expansion of their services throughout the 1970s and 80s.
The mission eventually moved into a much larger 86-bed facility at 922 Park Avenue. And in 1971, they had to confront a new, heartbreaking reality. Women were increasingly finding themselves destitute on the streets of Dallas. To address this, they opened a 23-bed women's division, initially managed by Dorothy Lacey and later by Janetta McGarry.
This brought an entirely new demographic and new challenges into the building. The men and women were kept strictly separated for sleeping and eating, but they shared the chapel services. And this new division brought in characters who defied every expectation of what a homeless person looked like. Most notably, a woman referred to as Mrs. Teetsy.
Mrs. Teetsy is a fascinating psychological case study. She was an elderly, notoriously grumpy woman who lived in the women's division. She wore tennis shoes everywhere and had developed a bizarre, compulsive habit of stealing and hoarding the toilet paper from the mission's bathrooms.
The staff is just treating her as a quirky, difficult resident. They're managing her hoarding behavior as best they can. Then one day, a Dallas City tax officer happens to visit the mission on other business. He sees Mrs. Teetsy walking down the hall, freezes, and asks T.J. Sullivan, why is she here? Sullivan replies, well, she lives here.
The tax officer's jaw hits the floor.
Yeah. He informs Sullivan that this grumpy woman hoarding toilet paper is secretly a millionaire who owns valuable real estate all over the city of Dallas.
Sullivan confronts her with this information. He gently suggests, if you have this kind of wealth, you could build a beautiful home in North Dallas, hire a private security guard, and live in luxury. She flatly denied having a dime. She absolutely refused to acknowledge her wealth.
Why? Why choose a cot in a homeless shelter over a mansion?
It highlights that homelessness is not always strictly an equation of financial poverty. In her case, it was driven by severe mental health eccentricities. She likely suffered from extreme paranoia or a profound unmet need for communal connection and safety that her money couldn't buy. The shelter offered a structured, predictable environment where she felt invisible but cared for. She eventually moved out, and upon her death, left an estate valued at around $100,000, a massive fortune at the time.
Tragically, the women's division was forced to close in 1987. The inner-city environment surrounding the Park Avenue facility had deteriorated so severely that running a co-ed shelter became an unmanageable safety risk. But their expansion wasn't just limited to women. They also looked at the generational cycle of poverty and decided they had to reach children before the streets claimed them.
This led to the creation of Camp El Har. Board members recognized that waiting for broken adults to walk through the doors wasn't enough. They started driving a printing van into the most impoverished, dangerous neighborhoods of Dallas on Saturday afternoons. They would pick up children, bring them to the mission for stories, songs, and food, and eventually launched a fundraising campaign. They raised $110 per child to send 50 inner-city kids a year out of the concrete jungle to a summer camp in the country.
It's a beautiful expansion of empathy. But in this line of work, empathy is constantly colliding with brutal physical reality. I want to ground this in a specific sensory moment. In 1980, the Dallas Times-Herald published a vivid, harrowing article about the hawk.
The hawk was the street slang for a bitter, freezing blue wind that would periodically sweep down from the Texas panhandle, dropping temperatures violently and suddenly.
The newspaper described a Monday night where the wind chill plummeted to 16 degrees. The mission was legally and physically designed to sleep 86 men. That night, As the Hawk ripped through the city, the staff packed 250 men inside. The article describes men covering every square inch of the floor, sleeping under tables, huddled in hallways. They were coughing, moaning, shivering, desperate to beat the curfew, because staying outside meant freezing to death on the concrete.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it perfectly illustrates the agony of triage in social work. You are a mission director. You know that packing 250 unwashed sick men into a poorly ventilated building meant for 86 is a massive violation of city fire codes. You are drastically increasing the risk of an outbreak of tuberculosis or a violent riot breaking out in the cramped quarters.
But the alternative is worse.
Exactly. The alternative is leaving 164 men outside in 16-degree weather, which guarantees hypothermia and death. They had to abandon idealistic safety protocols and operate in the gray area between legal compliance and moral survival.
And as the mission navigated these agonizing gray areas into the late 1980s and 1990s, the societal landscape shifted again. The era of the wounded healer, guys like T.J. Sullivan making gut-wrenching calls in the middle of the night based purely on instinct, was ending. The complexity of modern addiction and nonprofit compliance meant the mission had to evolve into a structured, professionalized system.
This transition was spearheaded by Bill Thompson, who took over as executive director. Thompson's profile was the antithesis of Sullivan's. He wasn't a Texas farm boy. He was a former chemist from Syracuse, New York. He brought an analytical, scientific, highly systematic approach to the organization. Under his leadership, the Union Gospel Mission stopped being merely an emergency soup kitchen and evolved into a formalized recovery institution.
He implemented what they called the discipleship program. And let me tell you, this was not just listen to a 20-minute sermon and get a bed. This was a rigorous, highly structured, 4-phase spiritual and behavioral boot camp designed to last anywhere from 6 to 12 months. It demanded total commitment. We're talking mandatory 4:30 a.m. wake-ups.
The 4:30 a.m. wake-up is crucial from a neurobiological standpoint. When you live on the street, your circadian rhythm is completely dictated by danger. You sleep during the day when it's safe and stay awake at night to protect your belongings. Waking these men up at 4:30 a.m. forces a jarring, complete reset of their circadian rhythms and neurological baseline.
Along with the early wake-ups, they had intensive daily study, mandatory chapel, and assigned manual labor to maintain the mission's physical plant. The final phases involved a structured transition to independent living, teaching them how to manage personal finances and ensuring active integration into a local church community.
Thompson recognized that initial spiritual conversion, while vital, was only the spark. Long-term rehabilitation required entirely rewriting a person's behavioral and neurological routine. You had to replace the chaos of the street with an almost monastic level of order. However, as the mission systems became more professionalized and their fundraising operations grew more sophisticated, they unwittingly exposed themselves to a new kind of trauma white-collar crime.
Yes, the 1992 embezzlement scandal. This is easily the most heartbreaking betrayal in the mission's modern history. The mission had been painstakingly raising money for a new warehouse building. They partnered with a respected Garland businessman and financial advisor named Charles Emmons, trusting him to invest and safeguard their building fund donations.
They entrusted him with roughly $300,000. Now, contrast that with the $1.98 they had in the bank back in 1955. This $300,000 was the culmination of thousands of small, sacrificial donations from local church congregations and elderly widows mailing in $5 checks. It was sacred money, and Emmons systematically embezzled it. When the mission finally went to withdraw the funds to purchase their new building, the accounts were empty. The money was gone.
It is so incredibly dark. You have a wealthy, respected financial advisor in a tailored suit, sitting in an air-conditioned office, deliberately stealing from the literal poorest, most vulnerable people in his city. You would assume a financial blow of that magnitude, combined with the sheer psychological betrayal, would instantly bankrupt and destroy the mission. But miraculously, they didn't fold. The donor base was notified, the community rallied, donations held up, and they survived it.
It really is a testament to the community's trust in them.
It is. And I want to contrast the absolute moral bankruptcy of that wealthy financial advisor with another story from the shelter floor just 4 years later in 1996. The story of an 18-year-old named Daniel Brown.
Daniel's story is one of the most poignant testaments to what the mission had actually built. Daniel was a high school senior actively attending classes, but he was homeless, living inside the mission's shelter.
I want you to picture the visual contrast of this scene. You're inside a crowded, noisy downtown shelter filled with men battling addiction and mental illness. And right in the middle of this room, over his specific cot, Daniel has proudly hung a brightly colored kente cloth embroidered with the words, Class of '96. On his tiny allotted desk space, he has neatly stacked his textbooks and dictionaries in 3 different languages. He is sitting there, typing his high school homework amidst the chaos of Skid Row.
You might expect an 18-year-old in that environment to be preyed upon, robbed, or dragged into the destructive habits of the older men. But the exact opposite happened. The men enrolled in Bill Thompson's discipleship program, hardened men, former felons, recovering drug addicts, saw Daniel and essentially adopted him. They formed a protective wall around him.
There is a quote from a man named Moses Martin, who had recently gotten out of jail on drug charges. Moses said that the older men actively used their own ruined lives as a living testimony to keep Daniel focused. They would point to themselves and say, "Look at me. Do not make my mistakes. Keep studying." They fiercely protected his physical space and his right to get an education.
It beautifully synthesizes the profound irony of the human condition. It definitively proves that true moral character and integrity are completely divorced from socioeconomic status. The wealthy advisor trusted with the bank accounts lacked a shred of the integrity that these destitute recovering felons possessed in abundance.
And it also validates the discipleship program.
Exactly. It shows what Thompson's rigorous system had actually achieved beneath the surface. It formalized what the mission had been doing organically since 1949. It created a surrogate family for the abandoned. Those men protected Daniel because the mission's structured grace had rewired their brains, teaching them how to care for someone other than themselves.
Which brings us to the breathtaking scale of our deep dive today. When you pull back from the individual stories of the embezzler, the Marine, and Daniel Brown, and look at the aggregate data, it is almost incomprehensible. Between 1949 and 1989, the Union Gospel Mission served an estimated 1.5 million meals and provided 1.5 million nights of lodging.
1.5 million. And it is crucial to remember they achieved this without a massive corporate endowment, without a guaranteed federal pipeline of funding. They survived on $25 checks from local churches, bulk mailings to ordinary citizens, and a sheer, stubborn, irrational level of faith.
So, after tracing this 50-year journey through chaos, addiction, strict ledgers, and profound grace, what does this all mean for you listening today?
I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over. We have spent this time examining the granular, gritty history of one localized building in Dallas. We've seen a group of people operating out of a cramped facility with a leaky skylight, fighting through near bankruptcy, internal administrative warfare, and devastating embezzlement somehow managed to touch 1.5 million lives. They provided the environment that rewrote the destinies of murderers, wartime veterans, and homeless teenagers.
Unbelievable.
It is. So the question is, what is the untapped potential of your own neighborhood? In an era where we instinctively default to expecting massive, impersonal, systemic programs to solve every complex social ill, this history challenges us directly. What could actually happen in your community if, instead of waiting for a systemic solution, you simply opened your own doors, embraced the chaos, and offered just 15 minutes of your time to the person you usually step over?
That is an incredibly powerful question to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Great is Thy Faithfulness. It has been a profound journey exploring the grit, the structure, and the relentless human endurance of the Union Gospel Mission. Until next time, keep diving deep.